Yeah, we're now recording, so we'll do it this way around. So today we'll be talking about how do you know how to train, or what does training to compete actually mean? And it is a deliberate title, and we'll come into that in a little bit more detail. But I guess the first question, which if you're joining this by later, as in you're watching the video recording, you'll need a pen and paper around beside you. But if you think about it, what is for you? Where do you see yourself in terms of that training to compete element? Do you see yourself as someone who's training to compete? What does that mean for you? I'll give you a couple of minutes, and then we can kind of go around the extensive room and see what that feels like. Go on then, Yanis. What does training to compete mean to you, and do you see yourself as someone who is training to compete?
I think for me, training to compete is knowing what your races are, when they are, and what the sessions that you're doing in training are for, and how they apply to the races that you're doing.
Okay, so kind of quite clear goal-orientated training.
Yeah, I think that's what we've done a lot of, actually. I think it becomes more clear when you really specialize in something or another, because you can really see what the sessions are for, I guess, maybe.
Okay. How about you, Millie?
I might be reading too much into your wording, but like I definitely train to race. I have my clear race goals, training goals, kind of with that. But in terms of compete, it's definitely kind of I'm training to compete with myself, but I'm definitely not kind of training to compete up there with others necessarily at the moment. So yeah, I don't know, like maybe I'm reading too much into the wording race versus compete, but I'm definitely training to race. There's a clear plan, there's clear goals within that. I'm not just sort of rocking up at a race and running it for fun. There's definite goals within that, but whether it's kind of compete, I don't know quite whether I would say yes, I'm definitely training to compete at this stage in my training.
Okay, so if we kind of park that, we'll come back to that one. Kind of if you've written it down, it's a good place to sort of start as a kind of, okay, that's where I think what I think I mean by this phrase. So I deliberately chose that phrase because there is a thing in sort of, I guess, performance sport called the long-term athlete development program, and I'm fairly certain it kind of comes from the Canadian sort of pathway and development of athletes, and it was definitely looked into by British Triathlon. They now have a sort of their own British Triathlon athlete pathway, ultimately leading towards one race, one day, sort of kind of building up to the ability to perform essentially at the Olympic Games is where they're looking at it in their athletic pathway. But this is sort of the long-term athlete development process. I'm going to go into the details of it in a second, but very, very briefly, just running through the things you can see there. It starts off with fundamentals. You learn how to train, you then train yourself to train, then you train to compete, hence the deliberate phrasing of the words, and then you're kind of competing to win. So I guess looking at yourselves, and again, if you're just watching this video back later, kind of have a think about that. Where would you put yourself on that scale in order to sort of, whereabouts would you put yourself? And I just would say as well, competing to win, clearly in the grand scheme of Olympic Games winning stuff, one race, one day, that's sort of where they're looking at it. But when you apply this sort of more to age group level sport, competing to win doesn't have to be winning a race overall. I would sort of put that down as sort of nailing the kind of the dream goal that you might have, whatever that is. Yanis, where would you put yourself on that?
I think it depends on the race. But I think between training to compete and competing to win.
Okay.
So there are some races that I enter to win, and so I'm competing to win. And then I think a lot of my training is now got to the point where it's, for me at least, a case of what can I do to make myself as competitive as possible in the racing field.
Okay. How about you, Millie?
I would put myself somewhere in the broad spectrum of between like 2 and 4, and it'd be really interesting, Philip, as my coach, to sort of like get your view on that, because I'm only 3-4 months into my triathlon journey. There's grand ambitions there, but I'm definitely still, there's a lot of learning about how I'm training. There's a lot of stuff kind of going into that, but you know, it is kind of beyond that in some elements of it. So I actually kind of really helpfully answer that in a really broad, somewhere in that general sphere.
Okay, so if we go into a little bit more detail about how this was brought about, what each of those sort of areas mean, that might help firm up where you might position yourself. So kind of, Yanis, you're looking 4 and 5, sort of somewhere between there, and Millie looking 2 to 4. So when they kind of devise this up, this, as I said, is sort of looking, now you've got the British Triathlon Coach pathway, athlete pathway. When you look at that, it's looking for Olympic Games. So this is brought about in terms of athletic performance, and it is looking at it usually from a governing body's perspective, and it is looking ultimately towards winning medals at World Championship and Games as well. So given that we've got the Olympic Games starting in a few days' time, it's quite nice to kind of think about where that sits with us. So it looks all the way, I'm interested to start at the top. You've got that feedback loop. So it looks into the fact that they go through, they might do a couple, 2, maybe 3, or even 4. Or if you're some of the ridiculously fantastic athletes, it might be multiple, more than 3 or 4 Olympic Games cycles. And that's where that feedback loop is. They're kind of looking into, okay, well, we've got this athlete who's gone all the way through. We want to try and keep them within the governing body of that sport. So bringing them into coaching, mentoring for other athletes, or something along those lines. So that's where that kind of feedback loop looks at. If we go right back to the beginning, that fundamentals, because the fun is in capital, it's meant to be fun, but ultimately it's looking into those key skills, and this is designed for Olympic athletes. So if you think about that in terms of ages, that will be kind of 6 to 9 years old, sort of level, and if you can cast your mind back to doing any form of sport at school, it would have been sort of games orientated at a very, very basic level, motor pattern stuff. So playing things like tag and it, then throwing and catching, dodgeball, looking at very, if you like, fundamental, obviously nerd, but basic motor pattern skills, some kind of things about throwing, catching, moving further up. So if you use swimming as an example, it would be actually learning to swim, being able to float, not drown, etc. And so that sort of sits with most of your kind of fundamental skills within sport, and actually it's quite a broad range. It's not necessarily sport specific. When you start moving into the learning to train phase, that would be sort of early sort of teens potentially, so sort of 10, 12, 13 years old. You start understanding how training looks. So you might start seeing things like training sessions, and this is the session that we're doing today. Rather, today we're going to be playing around with passing and stuff like that. It's sort of more, okay, this is a session. And the athlete's starting to understand how those building blocks sort of sit in. Around about puberty, so for female athletes, that will be a little bit earlier. You start going into more of that training to train phase. And this is sort of the gateway into the next bit. So in order to be, if you look at kind of any of the professionals' training days, we talked about it the other day on the Zwift ride, Lionel Sanders' YouTube's channel, and he's sort of saying, oh, wow, look at this the training day I'm doing. And he's very honest and open about how he feels. But I mean, a life and a day of the pro has been around for many, many years, maybe not necessarily a YouTube channel, but definitely either a video or a blog or a talking through podcast type thing, anything really. There's been quite often a life and a day off a professional. And usually when you look at those life and a day off professionals or a week of a professional, they're pretty punchy weeks. You look at big training rides, you look at big training sessions, you look at big mileage, big intensity, and everything else. And in order to get to the point where that can be a training day, and let's just assume that every day is the biggest day, which you can see on that, and that's not just for the camera. But if you look at that, you need to be in a position where you're able to actually do the training or build yourself up to get to the point where you can do the training in order to do the training to compete. So this, if you like, is a preparation phase of training. You're going to start increasing the mileage. You're going to start increasing kind of what you're doing. You're going to find out how your body's reacting, learn how to recover, and all those sort of good things. And ultimately getting yourself ready to put in the big stuff, the kind of the key workouts, which you need to go and do. If you think about stepping up a distance, the first time you go and do an Ironman race, probably most of the stuff you're going to be learning how to do is actually being able to go the distance. The next time round you go through it, you're going to be like, okay, now how can we kind of start picking up the kind of the training and more specifically for that? So I'm not just trying to aim to ride for 6 or 7 hours, but I'm trying to ride for 6 or 7 hours, put intervals in there, get really hard, get really fast, etc., etc., etc. Then you kind of go into that training to compete phase. So once you've built up that ability to do the training, you now need to start trying to think about how am I going to get myself faster, and that's bringing, in some ways, a bit more intensity in there, a bit more focus into the training sessions. And then once you've got that intensity, you're starting to kind of push up. You're now starting to say, okay, well, I'm now competing. I'm getting onto podiums, top 10s, winning stuff, regional races, etc. How am I going to start winning stuff? And ultimately, again, winning in the grand scheme of the sort of Olympic game type things that are what this plan was designed for, but actually looking into kind of the age group sort of side of things, it might be more, how am I building myself into a position where I'm competing to win my age group, or I want to try and beat a PB, which I never thought was possible. That whatever that is for you, that's your competing to win. So that's sort of how it comes across. That competing to win stage will probably be in the kind of early 20s, if you think about when most athletes are peaking. Again, something like swimming might be a little bit earlier, younger. Some of the longer distances that you might find and come across might be a little bit later on. But roughly speaking, that's how the kind of that athlete life cycle kind of looks for people going through it. So again, going back to you guys now, where do you see yourselves on that list? Has that changed your mind at all, or do you feel kind of more confident about where you are? Go on then, Millie.
Yeah, I kind of what Yanis was saying as well, like it kind of is probably slightly race or year dependent or whatever, but still kind of vaguely I'd put myself somewhere around 3. There's definitely a lot of learnings going on, beyond the learning to train for sure. I'm pretty familiar with what the sessions are and why we're doing them and the blocks kind of the any ATP or anything, but then within that I think still training to train for me. Like I've not really competed in triathlon before, so there's a lot kind of within that, I would say. So probably around in that vague ballpark, but more within the solid 3, I think.
Cool. Yanis, would you change any of that, or?
I don't think so. No. What do you think?
So let's answer your questions with another question. Where would you put yourself in swimming? Either of you. What about cycling? Where would you put yourself on cycling? What about running? Yanis, you're doing we're planning on doing a triple Ironman this year. Where would you put yourself in terms of your triple Ironman training perspective compared to doing your Holcomb race that you did?
Yeah,
would they all be the same place?
No, definitely not. That's what I mean, is that if I'm going to a local 10, I might be trying to win that, but if I'm going to Ironman Lanzarote, definitely not competing to win. So it depends race to race where I kind of sit. I think, the triple between 3 and 4 probably. Whereas that's not on the cards now, so that's kind of why I then put myself 4 to 5.
Yeah. Millie, how about you? If you start breaking things down a bit.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that's why I put myself in that really broad ballpark, because it is 3 sports. I grew up as a competitive swimmer, so with that kind of definitely erring on the side of more of the training to compete, although haven't, you know, trained for that for a while, so there's a lot to learn. Whereas actually the bike is so new to me that I probably put myself beyond a 9 to 10-year-old, but you know, it is still very much in the learning to train phase. I am just getting the time on the bike and getting out for 4 hours. I'm kind of not really going hugely beyond that at the moment. So yeah, it's interesting when you break it down, probably each is in quite a different space. But yeah, I'd be interested to know, you'll probably answer it with another question, but yeah, where you'd put each of us, knowing us.
Yeah, so I think the first thing is, again, for people at home, you know, you've got that piece of paper, you've got those phases, draw them at the top, and let's start putting down some of those things. So, you know, where do you put yourself on swim, bike, and run? And start thinking about how that might influence your training as you do it, or your approach to each of the individual training sessions. Clearly, obviously, changing distances will impact things a little bit, and probably move you back down a little bit. So kind of going from that sort of, if you've been very competitive, let's just say over the sprint or Olympic, and you step up to a 70.3 or an Ironman, then yeah, you might find that you actually need to go back to training to get your body ready for that. If you think about it though, how many of us have really good technique when it comes to, say, swimming, which is, everyone knows a lot about technique and looks into technique. What about running? You know, how good is your technique there? As I mentioned, this is designed for, if you like, that early child coming into a sport and then going all the way through. It doesn't matter what sport that is, but what we've already done is dislocated that up and said, okay, well, where are you in terms of swim, bike, and run? But a lot of times, especially as coaches, well, we have athletes who come in to join us as a coach, and we spend a lot of time talking about fundamentals in terms of, say, swimming or running technique, or if they're picking up injuries all the time, they're actually still down in the fundamentals or the learning to train phase because they haven't got those fundamentals in order to do any of the training. So when you start thinking about not just swim, bike, and run, but we're starting to break things up a little bit further, where do you find yourself in terms of the actual skills that you're trying to do, swim, bike, and run? What about transitions, which is obviously the fourth discipline of triathlon? Are you able to do a flying squirrel, mount on the dismount line, or is that not something you can do? Because if you can do it, then you're probably in a position where you can say you can compete to win, because that's a time saver. If you can't, then you're still kind of within triathlon anyway, in that learning fundamental section, because your skill set for the sport, plural sports for triathlon that you're trying to achieve in doesn't actually kind of materialize yet. You still have some sort of areas to improve on. You don't have to answer this one, but have a think about where you might sit within this in terms of work. You know, where I know, okay, Millie, you're retiring, so that doesn't count. You're not in the feedback loop just because you're leaving your job, but kind of where do you find yourself in terms of your working environment? And now let's start thinking about that in terms of your psychology. You know, in terms of your performance psychology, where are you? Are you someone who's actually very driven? And funny story, a lot of triathletes, you know, it's sort of classically that alpha type triathlete who comes on board, and if you were to sort of almost stereotype them completely, it's usually kind of I guess middle-aged men in lycra, kind of alpha male type person trying to do lots. They probably categorize themselves in anything which they do in that competing to win. Now that's definitely broadened out a lot over the course of the last 5 to 10 years, sorry. But a lot of the time you might find that your psychology is at competing to win, whereas actually they might be rubbish in the pool and they kind of have legs which look like they've had anchors strapped to them. So they're actually still in the fundamental section. So how do you match up the kind of the psychology again with the sport? Where does that fit in? I've got a few rowers who I'm coaching at the moment, so I'm not picking on either of those or any of those ones actually. This is another athlete I've coached who was a rower and then came into the sport of triathlon, and they've been a very high performance rower, and they were definitely in that competing to win stage as a rower. But then when they were starting to do triathlon, and sure, in some of the disciplines, they were kind of quite capable of doing stuff. Definitely in that kind of training to train phase, more specifically for triathlon. But in some of the other ones, they were, I mean, they really weren't in that level at all. They were kind of in the fundamental section, and they had a lot of distance to go before they started getting out of the learning to train bit. And actually, when you had that conversation with them, you had to remember you were talking to somebody who had a very high performance mentality. They'd raced at the high level. They knew what they were talking about. They were in a competing to win situation as a psych, from a psych perspective, but actually they weren't in terms of their ability level either. So it is very, very dependent and mismatches. And again, where your head might be is great competing to win. You might be really robust, really strong, but you need to recognize where you are within all the different aspects of triathlon. Let me give you a really good example. Where would you put, if we talk about bike fit, where would you put bike fit on that scale? Where does bike fit matter?
At the beginning.
You mean?
I'd put it sort of,
Okay.
Or maybe 1 or 2. Maybe once you've, learned how to ride a bike. I'd definitely put it early on personally.
Yeah. Okay.
Because, yeah.
Do you mean where is our bike fit at, or where do we put it on
If you
the
said
list of things to do?
Yeah, if someone, you said bike fit, where would you put it? Someone, you're doing triathlon. Well, when should I do a bike fit? Where would you put it?
Every stage.
Every stage. Okay, talk me through that.
I haven't stopped bike fitting since I started. I don't think. It's always been, can I get more aero and stay comfortable? Is everything working? Does anything hurt when I do a really long ride? Okay, is it position? Is it action? What's doing that? So I've constantly just changed the position in little bits as much as I can, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So you're right. At the beginning, at the fundamental stage, bike fit is actually all about safety and comfort. Can you reach the brakes? And are you comfortable? If you're comfortable, you're going to go ride your bike. If you can reach your brakes, you're not going to get scared. So you're going to be able to stop, in which case you can start focusing on trying to build in skills. The third component of bike fit is speed. And that will evolve over the course of the time. So it's going to be less and less about comfort. I mean, it's ultimately, you still need to be comfortable on the bike, no matter what level you're racing at. But if you're doing a track cycle event, which lasts, 30 seconds, you can probably tolerate a little bit of discomfort for a huge amount of aerodynamic advantages if you're going 60k an hour. So there's sort of slight differences there. But assuming we're talking about endurance sports, comfort for an Ironman is going to be just as important as at the beginning as it is at the kind of the fast end, because if you're not comfortable, you're not going to hold your position. But yeah, as Yanni said, you're starting to bring in the speed element more and more and more. But unless you've got the ability to be comfortable and safe on your bike, you're not going to be anywhere near trying to go fast. And triathletes have a really bad rep within cycling as not being able to control or use their bike effectively. And having been on the receiving end, and deliberately so, of that, and also having watched triathletes and coached them for a long time, I would agree with that. Generally speaking, most people have bikes which they can't control. It's a bit like me saying, hey, Lewis Hamilton, I know you've got Silverstone coming up, but can I use your Formula One car? I have no idea what I'm doing in it. And clearly I won't drive it anywhere near as effectively as he can. I'll probably be quite dangerous in it as well. And I won't be comfortable riding in that sort of car and that fit, if you like, for that car. And the same is true with bikes. Bike fit changes at every step of the way. So with nutrition, it's at the first point, nutrition might not even be something you consider when you're doing a triathlon. Definitely, I'll take some water or something. As you go through, especially as you go into longer distances, you might start thinking about, I need to take some gels on the run. I might start needing to think about, what do I need to have in terms of kind of anything beforehand, what about stuff afterwards. Then you're starting to refine diet. At some point, probably and realistically later on, you might start thinking about body composition and how I can maybe adapt and change that in terms of performance, if that's something that even needs to be done. You'll start thinking about fueling strategies, how to be optimizing those. You consider hydration, different temperatures, and all those other things start coming into it. But again, that's something which would evolve as you go through. And likewise, psychology will both evolve, but also change as you go through as well. So, initially it might just be, oh, I'm really worried about doing this race. I've never done one before. And then as you do more, you put more weight on your shoulders. Suddenly there's probably a few more anxieties going into this race, but you start thinking about those sort of small gains that you can have. And a lot of the time people think sports psychology is all about the kind of the well-documented sports psychology things, so mindfulness or visualization, focus things, chimp stuff, all those sort of things. And actually, a lot of it is more about sorting out everything else before you get anywhere near the high performance end of it. So again, thinking about where you are in each of one of those things, if you're worrying about life stresses, so you aren't stable at home, or finances aren't stable, or you're struggling to fit in time to do training and stuff like that, that's probably going to impact you quite significantly and needs to be addressed before you can go anywhere near the training to train side of things, because that's where you need to learn how to deal with all those things and your training and bring it all together. So all these things kind of start tying into the life cycle of an athlete. And one of the things that we do within Try Training Harder is we start addressing, yes, this is a plan, which is a program which has been designed for children. We very rarely deal with children within Try Training Harder. All of our kind of athletes are adults, and we do some stuff, but it's very much, we are working with adults here. This still applies. Athletes are still learning how to swim. Yes, they might be able to stay upright or stay floating in the water, but actually we need to still teach them how to swim, and they're still learning about fundamentals, going into the open water, putting a wetsuit on for the first time, getting used to that environment, all fundamental skills which are trying to do. Transition stuff, fundamental skills, and then applying that within your training starts coming more and more as you go through. So when you look at the kind of question of, well, what does it mean in terms of training to compete? It means really that you need to have that as your lowest common denominator with all the different things that you're doing, because otherwise there'll always be something which you're still learning about how to do. So yeah, sure, if you're able to smash out and you are winning events and doing very well within events, which are local or otherwise, if you're still working on some of these areas over here, you're still not in the point where you're competing to win, because you will always have a chink in your armor, which will get exploited when you start going in the bigger and the biggest stages. So you need to look at this as sort of a holistic thing, and almost whatever your weakest area is, you need to work at that to try and close that off. And yeah, sure, every triathlete has a favorite discipline. You look at Lucy Charles, for example, her strength is her swimming. Clearly, she's still working at her swimming and she doesn't kind of draw a line under it, but she's not then stopping there with the other two disciplines. She's still trying to improve those, so her overall triathlon experience or performance is better every single time that she races, which is sort of a cool thing to watch. Same with the Brownlees, who kind of, they're obviously been very dominant, but they're still refining certain areas and continue trying to do it because they're competing to win, and winning kind of you always need to refresh. But if they had an area which was a real weakness, they still need to go back and address that before they could start moving forwards. Look at the kind of transition into long course for Alistair as well.
I think interestingly for me, like Lucy Charles didn't learn how to do a flying mount until this year. That was the first time she learned how to do that, after many exhibitions at Kona.
Yep.
So yeah, everyone's still learning things, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was because when you look at kind of Kona versus, or long course versus the ITU stuff, kind of if she's wanting to compete to win, then she needs to be really fast through transitions, which means learning how to do a flying mount. And doing it really, really well and effectively every single time she gets on that bike. So yeah, that will pay off into long course potentially if she decides to use it, but it's an important part of it as well.
I think I was also like really flippant or dismissive of disc brakes until Holcomb. And I suddenly thought, you know what, I can see the benefit of having disc brakes now. Just after trying to maybe push things a little bit further, carry a little bit more speed, go a little bit faster, maybe starting to knock up against the limitations of a rim brake on a carbon wheel.
Yeah, so you can see how, again, different things are different that's talking about bike mechanics, which is again is an area or part of your bike. Let's just put it that way. How would a bike look when you look at all those different areas? Probably fundamentals might even have stabilizers on. Competing to win, it depending which race distances you're racing, draft legal, non-draft legal, it will look very different, but what you've got on the bike will be very, very different at each of those points. So what's appropriate for that person at each of those steps is also something that I guess you need to consider as an athlete, but also from our point of view as coaches, we're also considering that every single time that we have a conversation with an athlete. There's always that context element which we're trying to think about. And I guess as a coach, quite often we're competing with the stuff that people have read. I heard that I could get save this many watts if I go and do wind tunnel testing. It's like, that sounds really cool and that would be really good to do, but you actually can't descend and you can't corner. So those sort of 15, 30, 40, 50 watts that you can do, if you decide to put a bit more time in your bike handling skills, you probably save more time, not necessarily watts, than you could possibly imagine, just because you've learned how to not slow down that much. So it's also contextualized within the, for the athlete and where they are in each of those different skills. So I'll kind of give you a couple more questions. And a bit of a story. I remember when I was racing, which is many years ago, and before that, there was another time when I was kind of going through, and I think I'd been training for a few years. I had an aim of qualifying for Kona. That year, I came second in my age group, sore topic. I know exactly how many seconds it was between the two of us. And I had asked my coach that Easter, where was I on this scale? And he sort of was very honest, and he said, "Where do you think, Philip?" Funny coincidence in how I've been dealing with this one. And I was like, "Well, I know what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to qualify for Kona. I hadn't had that race yet, but that happened that year. So I was like, well, I'm probably in that training to compete sort of thing, maybe even pushing competing to win, because I needed to win my age group realistically to have a chance of taking that Kona slot." And he says, "Philip, you're still down at that learning to train phase. You still have a long way to go." And it was only kind of a year later, because I didn't qualify that year, a year later when I actually did qualify, and then a couple more years after that, when I realized how much further I had to go before I could get anywhere near that training to compete. You might have heard on some of these other conversations that we've had, we talk about, especially with things like qualifications for Kona, or if you're looking at the faster end, initially there's a possibility that you're going to do what you want to do, and then there's a probability. You can't have anything for certain because it's sport, but that idea of bringing in that training to compete, that training to train thing, there's a possibility that you could do really well, but that's definitely a possibility because it could just happen. Whereas when you start putting everything in position, you start working at those limitations, those weaknesses, the probability starts being, well, actually, what are the odds? What am I likely to be able to do in this one here? And you start stacking things in your favor, and then it's more probable that you'll achieve what you want to do. And that's starting to look into that competing to win section, when the probability starts saying, well, actually, your numbers look good. If everything goes well, there's not really a reason why you shouldn't, because your training is looking like everything's going in that direction. But if you look at it and you're like, well, if you have your best day ever, then you might qualify, you might hit the 11-hour mark, you might break 1 hour 15 for your sprint distance, or whatever it is that you're looking at trying to do. That kind of conversation is definitely more in that training to train element, and as opposed to sort of training to compete or training to competing to win. So I definitely found that and when I was going through that as an athlete myself, it was very, very noticeable that where I thought I was, probably because I was one of those sort of I'm driven, I'm wanting to try and win and kind of be really fast kind of persons, and my mindset was up there, because often it can go the other way. You can get people who are less confident themselves. They might say, well, I don't really know how to do anything, so I'm actually kind of I can't ride a bike, I can barely swim, I always come out of this water in third or fourth pack, I'm rubbish. So you can definitely find you might kind of bring yourself back again. But definitely I knew from and retrospectively definitely know from my psyche that I thought I was at that point, and actually I was probably a little bit further behind then. And it was only through going through the process of it that I started to realize how far back I was and how accurate my coach was when you're saying you're still learning how to train from that point of view. So with all that said and done, do we keep ourselves where we are? So yeah, Yanis, you were that 4. Millie, you was at 2 to 4, but then kind of said actually more of a 3. What do we think?
I reckon if you go on the lowest common denominator, I'm in 1. Like I've only done 2 triathlons, and in the first one I got stuck in my wetsuit. So, that's very much a kind of learning, very much in that kind of fundamentals phase. If I'm being like literally brutal and looking at all of the different elements, where am I? I'd have to say definitely in 1, because there are a lot of bits that are very still figuring out how that even works. Probably the ego in me wants to say 2. And I think most of my stuff probably is more in that than in the learning to train than in 1. So yeah, probably around there. But if I'm being really kind of like honest with every element, there are bits that I'm still very new to and figuring out. So hovering between 1 and 2. And I think that like the maybe it's whether it's a high performance attitude or like a pride thing, I think it's really interesting kind of that often your ambitions don't necessarily match up with skills, and once you kind of respect that, I think actually Philip, it was you that said to me after my first and only and second triathlon Olympic, kind of respect the distance. I went, I can run, I can swim, this should be fine, but actually I've never done that distance before. And it was really hard work. And actually it was quite good that it was hard work, because I went, okay, that was hard. And it kind of took me down a level in terms of respecting all of the different elements of it. And it's not good enough to say, well, I can swim and I can run, so how hard? And I'm not a cyclist, I know I can't cycle yet, but how hard can it be? But actually putting them all together, it's a very different thing. So kind of reevaluating that. And I think you can kind of, perhaps, I don't know, for me, I don't want to generalize, but for me, like if you can recognize that you can still have that high performance mindset and those ambitions, but actually still respect the fact that you're perhaps lower down on the scale, that's probably much healthier than kind of being totally mismatched with where you are, perhaps.
Let's come back to that. Yanis, where do you think you say you were if you were to look at that? I think Millie answered with a kind of, I think on average I'm at a 2, and I've got some bits which I'm still working on a 1, which is probably a fair way of doing it. So where would you say your lowest denominators are, and where would you say your sort of your average is, or is it still where it was but earlier? So that kind of strong 4.
I think it's difficult because I'm doing different races. So if I take the lowest form of racing that I have on the horizon, which is iron distance, I haven't ran an Ironman marathon, so I haven't run the whole marathon. So I guess in that respect, I need to be able to do that. So between a 2 and a 3 for the Ironman marathon, probably. So yeah, I think some individual aspects are a lot lower, but then I also feel that I do understand the purpose of training. I understand the purpose of different sessions, how my body feels. I'm quite in tune with how it reacts. And a lot of the training that I'm doing is to increase how competitive I am, which is why I lean towards the competitive training to compete marker, I guess. But yeah, I'm not really hung up on where I am. I think that's the thing, is that if I wanted to do something new, I'd be more than happy to go back to number 1 or 2 and start from there. And I know that because I've had to a couple of times when I've changed distances and changed sports and things like that.
So I think picking up, Millie, your point there around kind of being mindful of where you might sit on that scale, and Yanis, then you follow that up and say, actually I'm okay with where I am, it doesn't matter, and I'm okay with going down and then moving back up again depending what distance I'm doing, is a really important one, because actually if you're self-aware, and self-awareness is a huge part of I think performance just generally, and that's a different psychological conversation to be having, but if you are able to be aware of where you might sit on that scale, you'll then start finding that you're making better decisions around what you might need to be doing. So a mundane and obvious one, might be around worrying about a complete race strategy and tactics and looking into kind of who's racing and everything else. It's like, well, if you're just doing your first race, then let's not focus on that. Let's just go and have some fun and enjoy it. If you're looking at trying to win something and you know that tactics will be a part of your success in the race, then you kind of need to know who you're racing and what they're likely to do and start playing that kind of bigger game of chess. You might start thinking about, okay, how am I going to apply a bike plan to this event to kind of work in my favor and get the fastest possible time? If it's draft legal, clearly there's even more consideration around the tactics which comes into it, which you need to play into, again, think and consider about the people who are around there, your strengths and your weaknesses. So having a really good feel for where you are likely to be on this, and recognizing that it's not just your psychology and you said ego there, Millie, which is a great way of looking at it. And it's kind of all the different parts of it is really, really, really useful, because by doing that and sort of keeping your ego in check, I guess, by thinking about more of the kind of the process of it, you're definitely going to make better training decisions, better process-based decisions, and you're going to find yourself accelerating through. I'm not going to pick on bikes too much, but the really obvious one, which we get a lot of the time, is someone who doesn't have great handling skills on the bike and then goes out there and buys the best bike which they can possibly find and buy, and they still can't ride a bike. So kind of it was probably an ego-based decision. They want to look cool in their new fancy bike, but actually it's not going to really change their performance or the steps in order to get to their performance. So they've just sort of taken a sidestep, if you like. If anything, they've probably gone back a little bit because they need to relearn how to ride this new fancy bike. And they still need to make the steps of learning how to ride any old bike before they can start worrying about the performances that they have elsewhere. If you look at things like FTP tests and bike stuff on performances on the bike that way, actually the first FTP test you do is probably going to be your worst one. You have no clue about how to pace it. You'll either blow up or you say, well, actually I could have gone a bit harder. And it's going to take a few iterations of that to start really understanding the FTP test. And then over time, you'll start seeing those numbers improve as well. So understanding where you're at will help you make a decision quite often around training, which is definitely the kind of the right one. And again, I think a lot of the times, and it's totally understandable, we have athletes who come to us saying, I want to win my age group. I want to go away and do whatever it is. That's kind of why, or at the point where quite often people will come and get a coach. But realistically, until we've started to fix up all those learning to train things, training to train, being able to build up the mileage and the load which they need to do physically and mentally, they're not going to get, they will improve, definitely improve, but they won't really be training to compete or even competing to win, which is where they came to us to begin with, until they get to the point where they can go through those other steps first. And that's sometimes an interesting conversation to have with an athlete. You guys are great, obviously, but anyone listening, you might have a harder conversation to have. So yeah, that self-awareness is really, really kind of critical. So I guess now, are there any sort of more general questions? We can ask sort of general questions. You've got them, and if you've got any specific ones, we'll sign off the video kind of recording, and then we can kind of explore some of those if you've got any questions for a few minutes there as well, if you want to keep it a little bit more private.
I think you mentioned the bike, and that was something that I went through. I changed bike, and I went from being super comfortable going really fast on one bike to feeling like I was riding like Bambi on ice on the new bike. But it was a case of, okay, start from the beginning, build up your confidence, and then get to the stage where you can ride it the same as you would. And I think I've done that where necessary. And I think that is important to not be like, oh, well, I'm really comfortable with this piece of equipment or tech. There's no point exploring another option. I don't know, for me at least.
Well, think about it differently. If you're somebody who rides a road bike or winter bike, and then you go and have your race bike, be that a time trial or otherwise, it's a different beast. It's got a different balance point. It's going to feel different when you ride it. So you kind of, the time gaps between it's not going to be like go back to learning how to ride a bicycle again, but you're definitely not going to sit there and go, oh, by the way, I've just got my new time trial bike out. I'm just going to do 100 miles because, why not? I've been doing it on my road bike all the time and it's fine. Like, you need to rebuild back up some of that resilience. Yes, you can accelerate through that a lot quicker because you've done it before, but you still need to build up that resilience with that different bike position. We talk about holding aero position again. There's no point in talking about aerodynamics and having fancy testing in there unless you've actually in a position where you can sit in your aero bars comfortably for a very prolonged period of time. Yes, it won't be necessarily 100% of the race, but you should be able to be sat there in your aero bars for a large portion of it, and sort of find that position. Otherwise, you'll be sat up half the time. There's no point getting any sort of aerodynamic numbers on you because you'll be not able to hold the position in the first place. So it's kind of, as you say, just edging it kind of closer and closer towards that performance, and just kind of another go at making it even more effective.
I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this to make it more relevant from like an athlete perspective rather than a coach, but I can't quite figure it out. So in terms of kind of like either this scale or just in general, is it better, easier to work with, harder to work with, say somebody who's kind of really got that high performance mindset, really kind of not overconfident necessarily, but perhaps kind of mindset is beyond where skills are, versus perhaps actually very underconfident? Because I guess what's behind my question is there's got to be something in there about like having some sort of ability, like faith in your own abilities, and kind of like rather than sort of a very negative, well, I can't cycle, so I'm never going to be able to do this. I certainly know, like with my cycling, which is I'm very new to it, but actually I definitely started it with well, I can't cycle, I'm awful. But actually that's not a very helpful attitude either, and my FTP still probably got quite a long way to go just in terms of mindset and backing myself to cycle for that long at a high speed. So yeah, kind of is there a balance between that over underconfident faith, ego in your abilities, whatever we want to call it?
So I think that's sort of that self-confidence, self-assuredness piece. Is there an easier one for a coach to coach? Well, it depends on the coach. Some coaches will be fantastic at working with those sort of loud extrovert style, I've got this, yeah, no worries, I can do this. And a lot of the time the coach will be kind of pulling them back. And other times coaches will be really good at bringing the very best out of people who are a little more nervous. And I'm not saying that Alan can't do the ones with the kind of the people who are really good, but Alan's got a real skill at working with people who actually don't have that much confidence and can really bring the best out of them there. I mean, he's trained with both types, so I'm not saying he's typecast at all from one way, but that's definitely one of his strengths at working with athletes who are very, very kind of shy or kind of insecure about what they could potentially do, and bringing the absolute best out of them. I think if you look at either ends of those, it doesn't really matter. You're still coaching the athlete. You're still understanding what the athlete does mentally. Whenever I have a first conversation with an athlete, whenever I continue having those conversations with athletes, I'm sat there kind of, whereabouts does this athlete sit within this scale? Where are they? When you look at the swim, bike, run, clearly they'll have different things, and that's where you start putting out process-based goals in terms of where you might want to do your swim. You need to get your CSS to here. Actually, you need to be able to swim 400 meters non-stop. Then we can worry about CSS tests. It depends where that athlete might be within each of those different disciplines, and then also then tying it all together in terms of their overall performance, along with all the other parts which go into triathlon, from psychology to nutrition and thinking about other stimuli, thinking about periodization, obviously the planning side of things, how you put the plan together, strength and conditioning, injury management or avoidance. Where do they sit with the ability to do strength and conditioning? You know, some people, for example, are really comfortable with lifting and shifting weights in an Olympic gym. Other people don't know what they're doing. So there is still ways of getting them to perform, but ultimately they're still learning how to do S&C side of things. Some people have a great idea of what to do S&C wise, but they're going to get injured because they haven't got good biomechanics. So you have to go almost back to basics, get the physio type exercises and training done to improve there, and then pull them back up again through. So whenever as a coach you're still talking to that athlete, you're kind of almost thinking, maybe not necessarily using the scale, maybe using other methods, but definitely thinking or considering, well, whereabouts does this athlete sit? You know, what are the next steps to get them to perform? And if you go to those two examples of, you know, very confident athlete thinking this is where I'm at, unfortunately, the only thing which is going to make them realize that is when they start racing and realizing that they maybe don't have what they thought that they have, and understanding why. And as a coach, that can be really hard to try and bring about, because quite often that can be a pretty quick end to the coaching relationship, because like, well, you didn't get me to perform, so I'm not, you know, you're off, you're fired. And that then is probably more of a conversation around, well, you know, how do you manage the athlete and help them realize where they're at, which can be done differently with different people, and understanding. And how the coach approaches that does depend on the athlete. On the other end of the spectrum, you know, that's in lacking of confidence athlete who's trying to learn how to kind of build up. You know, there's a big piece around confidence and how you can instill confidence for an athlete, and that in itself is going to be different to each person. But quite often that looks at sort of baby steps and not worrying about, well, okay, fine, we don't need to worry about doing FTP tests yet, or maybe doing it in a hidden way without you realizing, or just doing things which kind of build that confidence up, and suddenly you've gone way better than you would have thought. A really good example of that is if you're afraid of heights and then saying to someone, well, you're going to jump off a 10-meter platform dive. The chances are you're never going to get them to jump off the 10-meter platform if you put them at the top of it, you know, cherry picker, just push them off and say, now jump. That's never going to get them to do it and do it well. They might have to do it and fall and have a horrible experience, but they're unlikely to do it particularly well. You know, you do it step by step, maybe go up one step and then come down again, go up 2, get to 3-meter point, have lunch in the 3-meter thing, you know, then come back down again. And you slowly build that up until eventually you get to the point where the athlete's able to do whatever that big goal is. And that's sort of true with any goal. You know, if you start thinking about the enormity of saying, I want to qualify and win the Olympic Games, kind of, there's a lot of steps which need to be in place in order to make that a probability rather than just a dream. Any other questions? No? Okay, cool. I'll end that here then for the recording, and thanks everyone for watching it again. I will stop the recording and stop recording.